Hey folks, welcome. I'm Matt Wilding. I'm, as said, the Director of Interpretation and Education here at Revolutionary Spaces, and I'm super excited to be here tonight with all of you. In political movements now and throughout history, controlling information, both its quality and its spread, is always important. In the past few decades, the rise of the internet meme has become a fast and potent way of spreading information to large audiences over social media. Sometimes to distribute, helping to distribute information democratically, but just as often distorting the truth or outright lying. As media has democratized in the 18th century, it was democratized in the 18th century, with more and more printing presses popping up all over the colonial world, pamphlets, broadsides, and other text-image combinations served a similar purpose leading up to the American Revolution. Sometimes, like in the case of Benjamin Franklin's Join or Die image, where colonies were represented like pieces of a snake, they were used to quickly articulate a potent message. In other instances, like the Boston Massacre engraving by Paul Revere, they depicted a story in a way that was, at best, a misrepresentation of facts in order to favor a specific group over another. It's with this in mind that it was an absolute delight for me to find out that Dr. Joan Donovan wrote a whole book about memes and internet culture, and in it made a direct connection to the 18th century symbols like Join or Die and the Gadsden flag. Dr. Joan Donovan is a leading public scholar and disinformation researcher specializing in media manipulation, political movements, critical internet studies, and online extremism. She is the research director of the Harvard Kennedy School's Shorenstein Center of Media, Politics, and Public Policy, and the director of the Technology and Social Change Project, or TASK. Through TASK, Dr. Donovan explores how media manipulation is a means to control public conversation, derail democracy, and disrupt society. She's the co-author of the book Meme Wars, which, by the way, is available for sale at the front desk. And she has appeared on The Problem with Jon Stewart on Apple+. She's also the former singer of the seminal Boston hardcore band, and I Can't Wait. Revolutionary Spaces is thrilled to host Dr. Donovan for a conversation tonight, so please welcome Dr. Joan Donovan. Welcome, Joan.
There's about 4 people in here that heard my old band.
Sometimes you just got to give a joke for you, you know?
Sometimes it's just for us.
Yeah.
And I've known Matt since we were teenagers.
Yeah.
And so this is great to see this come full circle.
Yeah, both of us are now allowed to speak publicly at large nonprofit institutions, some larger than others. But, well, this is great and really exciting for me. The book is fantastic, and I have a lot of questions.
Great.
Before we get into the specific questions about the work, I think it's important to just ask you, how did the project come to be? How did you even start doing this research?
Oh, that's a big question. I've always been interested in how people use technology. And so my dissertation research was really about how different social movements came alive during 2011, particularly the Occupy movement, but also other kinds of movements that didn't call themselves that, but were densely networked through social media. And over the years, as someone who researches social media, I've become more and more attuned to that it has paradoxical qualities, like all technologies. Some of it is good for society, and some of it is bad. And slowly over time, we've started to see more, I would say, harms coming out of social media, especially when certain political figures, authoritarians, use it to distort and lie at scale. And so we have some of the memes that are featured in the book with much longer explanations popping up behind us throughout this conversation tonight. And you know, feel free to ask any questions later about this, but I will explain some of them because they do have some historical resonances with things that have happened here in Boston, but also the way in which politics has often used cartoons and slogans as a way to convey a much deeper meaning. And I think for me and my co-authors, Emily Dreyfus, who she's formerly a senior editor at Wired. Yes, her dad was in Jaws and is the Richard Dreyfuss. I always say to her, I'm like, we're gonna need a bigger boat. So, you know, she's tired of the memeing. And then Brian Friedberg, my other co-author, works with me at Harvard. and he does anthropological cultural studies of the internet. And so us three as a trio really brought a lot of different things to the table in terms of the book. Myself, I'm interested in sociology, and so I want to know how groups behave. So I'm less inclined to talk about psychology or individual motivations to join certain political parties, but I can talk a lot and at length about all kinds of other garbage, but particularly about how things that we might consider soft messaging or persuasive messaging online is really having a strange effect on our politics. And we're starting to see ideas that used to be considered very, very fringe moving closer and closer to the mainstream. And so some of you probably recognize this over the years. If you would say, conservatives have gone over the edge with George Bush, by the time you get to Trump, George Bush seems like a liberal, right? And so there's a lot that changes with our politics, and also a lot that we need to adapt to, especially as we are going forward through this new technology and are not going to be able to undo the harms that it causes. We have to instead confront it as it is.
Great. And yeah, the book is almost entirely about 21st century digital technology and propaganda, which makes this an odd place for you to talk, right? 18th century historic site. But the reason we're doing this is because you and I had a conversation at a punk rock show a couple months ago where you mentioned to me that there's actually really direct connections to the 18th century in meme culture and meme symbolism. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so one of them is the Gadsden flag, which will be rolling by here. Don't step on Sneck, don't tread on me, it says that. And it's got a bright yellow background, and it'll have, a rattlesnake on it. And the Gadsden flag was something that could have been the official flag of America if it hadn't really been used politically in such a way that split the Union from the Confederates. And the Confederates really did, latch on quite tightly to the Gadsden flag as a symbol. And so Unionists started to switch to symbols like the eagle in order to convey their patriotism. But what's interesting about the rattlesnake, and it was something that I discovered in the early reading that I was doing about the book, is I wanted to understand what America meant to some of the founding fathers, some of the early folks, in particular Benjamin Franklin. What did it mean to be American to them? What was the essence of America? And the rattlesnake image came up multiple times. And he even wrote about rattlesnakes. And Americans, he says, are like rattlesnakes. They're going to warn you before they strike. But if they strike, it's going to be deadly. And I was thinking a lot about it in terms of some of the propaganda I was looking at online around this meme FAFO, which means...
You can say it. This is an adult.
Okay, we're all adults here. It means fuck around and find out. Right? So this is a meme that is universally popular amongst left and right-wing people, but it had been adopted by the Proud Boys, who recently, several of them were convicted of seditious conspiracy in the January 6th riots. But this whole meme of fuck around and find out, I was like, this is kind of like my generation's rattlesnake, right? It's going to be something that people are going to fight over in terms of what does it mean, but Benjamin Franklin really thought a lot about, well, what kind of animal should really symbolize America? And I have no doubt that, if the South hadn't taken over the Gadsden flag when they did, that we would probably be, pledging allegiance to the Gadsden flag rather than the stars and bars. And I think what's interesting about the way that symbols change over time is that political adoption of symbols really matters. And if we think about memes as the funny things people share online, we're missing part of the broader ways in which memes have affected us as humans throughout our entire lives. So most of us are familiar with memes as advertising. So if I say something to you like a catchy slogan like just do it or I'm loving it, you know what brand that is associated with. But psychologically, what those slogans are doing in using this sort of 3-syllable or 3-word pronunciation is tapping into something within us as humans, where, especially in the English language, that 3-word repetition seems to really hold us and is what people in advertising call sticky. Sticky advertising is usually memes as ads. And so what we wanted to show is that throughout the last at least decade or more of social media use, we've seen an acceleration or more and more memes come into the fray and then really affect what people do. So we're very concerned with, as researchers, what we call the wires to the weeds. That is, what is it that people are hearing that then motivates them to get up and do something different, right? There's, many of us will read something online. It's not going to, we're not going to go and change our vote immediately. But, there are certain things when you get health information, for instance, if it's not worded correctly, you might not take the advisement. So I'll give you an example of during the pandemic, we were all memed into believing that we could flatten the curve, right? So do you remember flatten the curve? Everybody was seeing it everywhere. But this was a marketing strategy to get you to stay home. Of course, it worked because none of us came into contact with each other. And so it's really hard to spread viral diseases when you don't get close to one another. But flatten the curve was really thought about by public health messengers as a way to convey a short burst of information that was very sticky, that got you to understand reams and reams and reams of medical research that you're never going to read by saying this is the one intervention that you can do. And so sometimes memes can be really persuasive and we don't even know they're happening. And throughout our book, we try to mark those moments. Particularly, Trump was very good at coining new memes like build the wall, lock her up, stop the steal. And so we had to go through these meme wars over and over and over again where people were coming into contact with these memes and then were literally getting into fights with each other online. And sometimes those fights would spill over into the real world.
Your explanation of memes is really interesting, using the example of just do it. So that's obviously an older meme, 80s or 90s, and it evokes to me in the 18th century things like taxation without representation is tyranny, and all these things that we kind of identify as core American values are actually just sort of sticky memes from the 18th century.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? All of those things that you remember that are shortcuts, in a way, to a much larger and more nuanced set of principles and values. And social media is very good at delivering this kind of communication because social media is nothing more than advertising. The back end of social media, so the things that serve us our ads on Facebook or Twitter or on YouTube, are the same things that serve up your content where you're, sending a message to your friend saying, good looking baby, wish I had one, right? Those same rails, is where advertising travels. That's how they make their money. And then users get to use those rails mostly for free. We don't pay to use social media right now, except Twitter is a new exception.
Yeah, and have you taken them up on it yet?
No, God, no. But I say this because social media, if the product is free, the product is you, right? And that is such an important thing to remember because you are being, in a sense, harvested or cultivated for your attention. And then social media algorithms try to figure out what is it that's going to excite you, what's going to inflame you, what's going to be novel to you, what's going to be outrageous to you, so that you'll stay on the platform longer. And this has some really dangerous effects when taken up by politicians or other kinds of folks that want to rule us when we don't have regulations about that kind of messaging. We have political regulations about messaging on the radio, in print, and on television, but we don't on social media. Social media, all political ads are treated as quote-unquote small items. So even though it's hundreds of millions of dollars a year industry, political ads online, it's treated as nothing more than a baseball hat or a bumper sticker. in terms of regulation.
So, you know, we've made some references to the American right using memes, and you talk a lot, really, you focus on the American right in this book. In the book, you talk about this extremely online, as you say, a group of people who use memes and quote-unquote shitposting to essentially give rise to a new nationalist right in America. And you characterize some of them as incels and racists, but one of the things that really stuck with me about the way you talk about them, very different from mainstream media, is you almost have a begrudging respect for their understanding of the medium. And I was just curious, can you talk about how the alt-right and the new right and associated groups were depicted in broader media versus the way you see them in your research?
Yeah, I think that unfortunately mainstream media has really failed to understand conservative movements. Across the entire spectrum, from what we would call hard right, far right extremists, all the way over to what you might call a rhino, Republican in name only. And what we noticed when we wanted to set out to write this particular history of the internet is that we didn't want to write another history about great men inventing things, doing, you know, amazing innovation, without really looking at, well, what's the human cost? What's the human toll here? And who is using this technology in very abusive ways? And in order to do that, we use the lens of looking at the far right quite a bit, because these are people who have to hide who they are, or they have to hide what their motivations are in order to convince you of something. And so in studying the development of media manipulation and disinformation campaigns, I consider the far right, the hard right, not conservatives, okay? So different from your Republican Party. Of old, I would say Donald Trump's party has had some insurgent tendencies, especially with Steve Bannon being so close to the alt-right and a younger generation of political dissidents. But what you realize is that these young people understand exactly how to manipulate social media and how to manipulate trends online so that they don't have to be a large audience, they just have to look larger than they are. And so they do numerous techniques in order to trick social media algorithms into thinking that more people care about a certain issue than really do. How do they do this? Well, they'll have live streams on YouTube where they'll tell the people that are watching them, hey, we want to make sure that this journalist shuts off their social media. We don't like what he or she has written. So they'll come up with a way on YouTube to go brigade or troll that person on Twitter. And you'll see it like a swarm will show up in someone's replies and in their messages, basically telling...
the registration for this event.
Yeah, the registration for this event, and our lovely security that had to show up. Because people don't want certain conversations to happen. And when I say that, you know, you might be inclined to think about, you know, leftist cancel culture, but I'm telling you this is something that happens across the entire political spectrum. And some use silence and violence as a way to keep certain conversations going or certain conversations from happening. And so what we wanted to do was understand those dynamics, and so we started to look at the advent of social media, what's changed. And we used to talk about social media as being really good for democracy, you know, but I think some of our pro-social movements, particularly movements for racial justice, equal rights, had a first mover advantage adopting social media early. It took the far right quite a long time to catch up. And one of the things that was very important in solidifying a younger far right that then was brought into the Trump campaign through Steve Bannon is an event known online as Gamergate. And so we have a whole chapter in here on this event that you wouldn't think is that big of a deal. It's, you know, there are several women who design games. There were a large group of men who thought that women designing games was bad for gaming. They thought this is our space, women don't need to be here, do your diversity stuff somewhere else, we don't need to have representation in video games. And so this phenomenon of Gamergate grew and grew and grew, and it grew and grew and grew. And then there was a moment, a flashpoint within Gamergate as people started talking about, well, what is misogyny? And how does misogyny operate? And is the gaming industry itself misogynistic? And this went all the way up to the New York Times, right? People in the New York Times were then writing about Gamergate and trying to understand what was happening in this small community on social media. But what was learned in that moment was that if you harass people, if you dox them, that is, you put their name and housing information online, if you SWAT them, that is, call the cops and say something's happening at their house that's not happening, and the cops go in guns blazing, that you can shut people up. You can use the mechanisms of the internet in order to look like, a big bad wolf, but really underneath it all, it's using the affordances of anonymity online in order to intimidate and harass people that you don't like. And those tactics then became central during the run-up to the 2016 election, where we saw folks attacking different politicians, but mostly Hillary Clinton, by saying essentially that they ran this whole campaign claiming that she was going to draft our daughters and that she wanted wives to go into the draft. And all they did was mimic her social media. They stole her logo, and they put this information online. And you can imagine content moderators, they don't know what to do with this. Do they contact the Hillary Clinton campaign and say, do you care about the draft? The rest of us know there is no draft, right? So that's not even part of her platform. But what these people learned is that through bullying, through harassment, through making up outlandish platforms for politicians, that they could have an outsized impact on the culture. And they could get the New York Times, and they could get Fox News, and they could get CNN to say the wrong thing. And they could trick journalists. And unfortunately, that became our politics. By 2020, we have fully become enmeshed in a politic where we have politicians who are literally lying about an election being stolen. And instead of it happening, with a few news organizations who can fact check and error correct, it's being broadcast over Facebook and over Twitter that Donald Trump is calling us to fight. Donald Trump wants us at the Capitol. And so, and this is where I'll end with this, because frankly, I forgot your question, but I'm getting there. The end part of this is actually quite interesting, which is Stop the Steal. Now, I don't know how many of you got Stop the Steal invitations on your Facebook page, but this was an entirely engineered campaign that brought together millions of people, and you had an entire array of people who were paid for working on behalf of Stop the Steal to reach out across social media and bring more people the message of Stop the Steal. So inside the workings of this, you have a dark political influence operation happening that began in 2015 when Roger Stone had registered Stop the Steal as a domain and had believed that Trump was going to have the primary stolen from him. So they had this plan in place all the way back in 2015 to claim that the election had been stolen if Donald Trump had lost the primaries. And so we were able to go back and look through digital forensics and look at purchasing records and look at attempts to build the Stop the Steal meme before 2020. And we were able to show that the same people that were behind Stop the Steal in 2015 just reanimated this dead meme and brought it to life, mostly using Facebook as a mass invitation tool to get more and more people enrolled in the Stop the Steal movement. And they had hundreds of groups, and it went on for months, their messaging campaigns. And so even if you didn't want to hear Stop the Steal or you weren't interested in it, everybody heard about it. and it was a very effective political campaign, but very similar to the way in which we think about foreign operators, foreign governments wanting to disrupt our elections. Instead, this was an entirely domestic campaign hatched by Donald Trump and Steve Bannon.
So I think you starting with Gamergate is such an interesting point, because Gamergate's such a small event. It happened a long time ago, but it, in my mind, kind of evokes other small historic events that people don't really realize are history at the moment they're happening, right? So in Boston in 1765, we have the Stamp Act riot, which is essentially a group of guys who are upset about a new tax, and they destroy a couple of warehouses in the lieutenant governor's house. And at the time, that didn't look like it was the beginning of a revolution, and in retrospect, it clearly does. And do you feel like, you know, in a way, you just kind of stumbled upon a beginning of a major history that we're living in?
I think the internet is a revolutionary technology. I would put it on par with the printing press. I think that what the printing press did to turn us all into readers, the internet did to turn us all into writers and publishers. And I don't want to forget that fact. I think that it's very important to imagine a world in which we can get along and have such free and open communication. However, with every technology, you have certain groups of people who are better positioned to take advantage of the affordances of that technology. And so when you look at the history of social media, of course, you begin with something like, you know, Zuckerberg basically deciding at Harvard that he's going to plagiarize a software that one of his friends invented, or two of his friends. They're twins.
Look similar, but they're two guys.
The two guys. And he decides that he's going to invent Facebook, which essentially was this tool for rating women in Harvard. You know, it was modeled on what's called Hot or Not. There's a great documentary coming out about YouTube called The YouTube Effect, put together by Alex Winter, who was in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Not Keanu Reeves, though. And the YouTube Effect, you find out that the history of YouTube actually begins in the same way, where they had decided that they wanted to have a place where you could rate women, and they wanted something like Hot or Not, but with video. So, you know, video dating goes online, and this is what you get is YouTube, and then you would be able to rate someone or comment about their bodies or what have you. That was the ambition of these websites. A place like Twitter was something where techies could message to each other about what bar crawl they were going to. It was meant to be a short cable system. It was never built for news. It was never built for information. Surely wasn't built for global diplomacy, that's for sure. And so we have these technologies that have been retrofit as they scaled to be our news and information hubs, our ways of connecting with friends and family, our ways of accessing entertainment. But there aren't many divisions on what any of that information is. And so when I was thinking about the early history of social media and trying to understand, you know, is it the technology the thing that's revolutionary? Is it the people the thing that's revolutionary? Is it what people are doing with the technology that's revolutionary? And, you know, I've come to settle on, I think it's all of those things. I think that when you design a technology, you cannot predict scale. You can't understand what's going to happen when, you know, 1,000 people, 1 million people, 80 million people, 2 billion people start to use the same technology. And more is different, just as in physics. And so when you add scale to this, it changes who can take advantage of you. It changes who can manipulate at scale. And in many ways, as I think about the potential here for harm and violence, it's something that, you know, we haven't really put a lot of thought into. Well, what is this information ecosystem, and how do we protect it as an environment? How do we make sure that there's space for different voices to grow? How do we make sure that it's not, you know, just endlessly producing weeds and carbon emissions without actually helping us build a more important public purpose? even our broadcast media has public interest obligations. Our social media doesn't. So you ever wonder why WBCN has got to like turn down the Pearl Jam every once in a while and tell you a little bit of local news and tell you a little bit about the weather? It's because they have to. It's a law. They wouldn't do it if they didn't have to. And so I think one of the things that I worry about is that we're building technology without thinking about, as you know, folks in the past who've done revolutionary things, you don't always think about what's the aftermath, what's the outcome there, and how do you bring back peace and justice and diplomacy in an area where, you know, unfortunately, it's those who have the most money have the most speech, and we've been there before.
Yeah, you know, you're bringing up the printing press. Again, prompts an 18th century thought, right? So in the colonies in America in the 18th century, you have access to printing presses at a level that is kind of unprecedented for people, and certainly less regulation, right? And that prompts a movement that happens sort of under the nose of the British Empire and gets out of control. And when I read your book, I was struck by how the internet, new technology, prompts these people to create a fringe movement that essentially puts a person in power right under the nose of people who have been in power forever. How did that happen? How is it possible that powerful organizations and powerful governments are able to just not notice when a technology that they are in somewhat control of is creating a movement right under their nose? Yeah,
it's a good question, and it's something that I've really struggled with, because I've you know, you always want to, in history we talk about counterfactuals, and the counterfactual would be, would Donald Trump have been president without social media? And I don't think he would have, because most mainstream media didn't take him seriously. He had run for president before and wasn't taken seriously. He definitely wasn't the Fox News candidate of choice. You know, they had Jeb Bush and the Bush dynasty that they were going to back. But things fell ass over head as Trump realized how you can use social media and things like getting people to go down the rabbit hole with you and getting them to develop an identity where somehow an American businessman is more trustable than a politician, right? And you're just kind of like, what are we trading off here, right? As icons. And Trump really was able to use social media to speak to multiple audiences at once. This is why many people read his social media posts as being completely just impossible to understand. At one point, he's posting Pepe the Frog memes, and another point he's posting, you know, memes about the NFL. Another point he's posting stuff about, you know, Barack Obama being a birther. And you don't understand who he's talking to. But there are all of these fringe groups online that are engaging with this material saying, he's talking to me. He understands me. He knows what I think. And he's going to bring that kind of justice to the U.S. government. And so this whole drain the swamp metaphor in particular was very powerful at getting people to think that Donald Trump was going to be able to subvert, you know, years and years and decades, if not centuries of, you know, American empire in a way. And that's where I think you can only run on charisma for so long, where, you know, by 2020, he didn't build the wall. He hadn't done the things that he was going to, he quasi-promised he was going to do in terms of stopping immigration. Although, you know, we did see quite a bit of, you know, people stopped moving because of the pandemic. There were lots of people that wanted to continue those policies post-pandemic and never open American borders again. He had disappointed the radical right flank, you know, the hardcore extremists, by even speaking to his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. These people are vicious anti-Semites. And so for him to have a Jewish brother-in-law was awful, right? And so all of these people that had come to see Donald Trump as a great unifier in 2016 because he was able to make all these promises. By the time 2020 rolls around, he just hasn't cashed any of those checks. And so people really, we did have an overwhelming turnout in 2020, so I don't want to discount the fact that, Biden did have a pretty big blue wave, but also a lot of people divested from the political process in and of itself through disappointment. And that, to me, I think is one of the overarching effects of using memes as your political tool or your political messaging, is that you tend to overpromise, you tend to underdeliver, and as a result, you don't grow a base of people that are in it for the long haul. They want short wins, and if they're not satisfied, they're going to move on to the next and probably even more extreme candidate.
I want to talk a little bit about the collapse of the meme coalition, but before we do that, you mentioned Donald Trump sharing this huge volume of memes that said really disparate things. And in a lot of those memes, there's terminology that most folks don't know, right?
Yeah.
So like keck and Pepe the Frog and I mean, there's dozens of them. How important do you think it is for someone utilizing memes to be able to speak to an audience with this coded language that other people just don't recognize?
Yeah, I think, let's take an example of 1776. So it's a date we've all heard about. I imagine there's some historical significance to it. Sure, yeah. I've only lived the last 10 years of my life, so, but online, 1776 represents a very particular kind of patriotism where the US government is completely illegitimate. It is being controlled by what's known as, this is not my thoughts, but these are the thoughts of these conspiracists that follow Alex Jones. Alex Jones sells a ton of 1776 merch, as does the Proud Boys, which is weird, right? They're both a T-shirt company and a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah, I mean, you got to get funding.
You got to get paid, right? But what's interesting about 1776 is it became this watchword for the U.S. government as it stands is completely illegitimate, even as Trump's in power, right? So Trump is he's the outsider that made it in, but is still a political outsider. The deep state, quote unquote, is controlling everything. And as a result, Trump is doing his best he can to lock her up, but he's really not going to be able to get things done, right? And so inside this online world, just by virtue of following a hashtag like 1776 or a keyword 1776, you can be brought into all of these, trails along the rabbit hole. And what's interesting about 1776 is you have a day like January 6th happen, and you have politicians saying things like 1776 will rise again, right? They're speaking back to that group of people that see themselves as insurgents, see themselves as the rebellious, dissident group that's going to bring democracy back to America, right? And this is such a twisted logic because instead of thinking about everything that would have to go wrong in order for someone to steal an election, right? All states are in charge of their own electors, right? There's no system by which electors are tallied in one go, right? It would be an incredibly intricate Steven Spielberg-esque feat to be able to rig an election in the United States, and that's just the facts. So you had folks like Chris Krebs, who was the head of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, saying this is the most secure election in American history. He was appointed to his position by Donald Trump, right, to make sure the election was safe and sound. So what happens? Krebs gets fired on Twitter. So, and basically, and then Trump starts to try to unwind all of the faith that we have in this system to be able to do something very simple, which is count votes, right? I know it's complex, but it's also something very simple. And but the notion of 1776 as a meme was so much at the forefront of January 6th that if you go back and start looking at the footage, you'll realize people have flags that say 1776, shirts, hats, all kinds of memorabilia. Where are they getting that? InfoWars. They're getting it from the Proud Boys, right? They're getting it from these fringe groups online that are making this merch. There's been lots of movements to try to get Amazon, for instance, to stop selling this merch through their website because it's enriching extremists, people that have been convicted of seditious conspiracy by virtue of, having their wares sold through Amazon. There's also been movements to get Amazon to stop selling Nazi memorabilia and Nazi flags. To some degree, it works. But by and large, I think the point I'm trying to make is that all of our symbols over time can become corroded and subversively used by different people and serving different political interests. And the one meme I'm most concerned about now is, what does it mean to be American? Because what we're seeing is a battle to define who counts and who doesn't as American. And as we move into a multicultural, multiracial democracy, that's going to matter more than ever. And we're going to see more and more clashes around patriotic symbolism because, unfortunately, the left has never been able to figure out how to put up an American flag on July 4th, right? Because the flag, to some people, represents colonization. It represents theft of property. It represents an affront to land back movements and indigenous cultures. And so at the same time that you have this conflicted politic about the history of colonization, you also have to have a firm grasp on, well, who counts as American? Because the stakes are too high to just let that be something that is, in the corner with these, fringe patriot movements that see themselves in their whiteness as the only thing that counts as American.
That was a great transition to my next question, which is, yeah, the right seems to be fantastic at utilizing American symbolism, whereas the left really struggles with it. And that doesn't seem like it's a new development, right? Why is it that the left can't figure out the American left can't figure out how to use these symbols?
It's a really interesting history, especially as we think about words, the development of words like African American or black. Black only became a popular term used in newspapers in Black American in the 90s around talking about communities in LA that were black but weren't from Africa, right? So you understand African American, just like German American, Irish American, would denote that someone was from Africa. But black is a more pan-African identity. That is, that it's bigger than Africa itself. And then it also extends to people who are dark-skinned but not necessarily from Africa or don't trace their indigeneity to Africa. And so when we think about our language and our struggle with inclusion of new terms, it's confounding to me because at the same time you think about American history and what people were fighting for when they came here, which had a lot to do with, from what I'm told, religious persecution.
Heard that, yeah.
I've heard about this thing that happened around this part of the world.
Sure.
I don't know about Salem, but, I have seen a movie or two about some witches. Puritans.
There were Puritans here, yeah.
There were those
too. This is
too.
a Puritan church, yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah. But anyway, I digress. I'm trying to get you guys to laugh, but it's not happening.
Yeah.
So, but in any event, what I'm trying to say is that, the founding spirit of America is perhaps a twin spirit that we have to recognize around indigenous cultures that were already here, that were using the land, that were cast aside and massacred, at the same time that we recognize the contemporary moment that we're in, where we are living in a world where, just because I say, you know, I want to liberate the land, it doesn't mean it's going to happen. There are contracts, there's landlords everywhere, right? And so, you know, we're not going to go back in time in any sense of the word. And I think that that's why it's important for us to think about, well, what are the institutions that brought us the most freedom here on this earth and in this world, including our press, our right to be educated, our amazing science and technology pioneers that have traipsed the halls of Harvard and MIT, as well as 2 or 3 other colleges, maybe Yale, I don't know. Definitely University of Florida. But what I'm saying here is essentially that
you gotta laugh.
We got a lot to be proud of, you know, in terms of the progress that we've made, but we have so much further to go. And I think that when we talk about technology policy, we have to realize that technology is a tool, a tactic, and a territory. And right now, as a territory, we are failing to govern social media in a way that respects human dignity, in a way that respects our nation's sovereignty or the sovereignty of other nations, and frankly is moving us towards more dignified public interest values. Instead, you have essentially what I would consider a smash and grab on capitalism, right? Where they're basically taking billions of dollars out of the economy, Musk, Zuckerberg, Dorsey, just to name a few, Bezos, and then they're deciding which pet projects they're going to fund, right? And this is the birth of a techno state, where they're going to decide through charity, instead of through taxes, how we're going to live together and how we're going to live our futures and what communication is going to be acceptable and what isn't. And I, for one, would rather be ruled by people I elect, but that's just me.
Now, we're going to open the floor up to questions in a moment, but I have one more question for you. Actually leans into your desire to get a laugh and possibly your failure. You mentioned a number of times in the book that there's an opinion on the right that the left can't meme, right? That we're bad at it, and maybe it's that we're too serious. Do you think that's still true? Do you think the left doesn't know how to meme, and why?
So it's interesting. I met with the White House digital strategy team, and there are pictures all up through their offices in near the West Wing of Dark Brandon, which is like Biden with the laser eyes. Yeah. And they're just like, look at what we did. We made Dark Brandon happen. And what they tried to do, which I thought was kind of cute, is they tried to subvert the meme of Let's Go Brandon. So this is an interesting story where you have a car race that's happening. The guy who wins it, his name's Brandon, and he's being interviewed by a sports journalist. And in the background, all you can hear is F. Joe Biden. And the announcer says, I think they're saying, let's go Brandon. And that's how the meme starts. And so anytime you're wearing Let's Go Brandon, it's code for F. Joe Biden. And it's funny, right? I mean,
there's a guy with a flag of it outside of Old State House every day, if you would
every
like to
day.
see this.
Let's go Brandon. So they decided that in order to counter this, they'd just make it even funnier by creating Dark Brandon. It's just this alter ego of Joe Biden that gets stuff done and is like funny in the comments and tells Trump to delete his account, stuff like that. And it's actually quite humorous, but I think about it and I'm just like, do we want the politicians that we want to respect playing in these, games in many respects? And I don't know. They're trying to land the meme this week of Bidenomics. I don't know if it's going to stick. It's actually kind of hard to say. I practiced it a lot before I got here. Bidenomics. Like, I can almost hear it rolling off the tongue. Yeah. But the left is a little bit more serious. Even something like the branding of Obamacare, for some people, is a very, very negative thing. For other people, it's a very, positive development in our inability to actually have health insurance.
Well, but you mentioned that you're not sure you want people who are governing us to be playing these games, but do you think that meme culture is just going to be part of politics now, or is this something we can escape?
I think it is part of politics. I just think you have to be careful the way you wield it. I would say the meme of the last decade has had to have been Black Lives Matter, right? And that meme is something that is universally understood. And what's interesting about that meme is it used to be that all lives matter was the slogan. And lots of people said all lives matter. Black reverends said all lives matter. Racial justice advocates said all lives matter. All lives matter only became an issue when the right wing picked it up and started needling Black Lives Matter activists with it and trying to say, you know, to the retort to Black Lives Matter is, yeah, all lives matter, in a very flippant, kind of transgressive way. And that's what propelled the meme of Black Lives Matter to be such a staunchly held belief that if you're not saying Black Lives Matter or you're saying other things aside from that, that you're not recognizing the movement in and of itself and what it means. Of course, we know all lives matter. But what's important about saying Black Lives Matter is different because of the way in which all lives matter is a meme operated as an insult to people within that movement online. And so it's a really interesting way in which we have to understand our culture and the evolution of our own language. But I haven't gone to a place in the world that doesn't understand Black Lives Matter as a movement about ending police brutality. You know, it's very plain. We're witnessing, though, a birth of a very toxic political meme around the word woke, which was a word used within Black and queer cultures up until about 2015, 2016, as a way to talk about the awakening in a movement. All movements have this rhetoric around awakening or, you know, rising to the occasion. So woke was a word that was something that came out of subcultures, and now you see DeSantis like putting that word on everything he can't tolerate, right? And it's become such a perverse insult that even now you have, you know, clip reels of people trying to explain what woke means to them, and they don't, like, they have no idea what they're talking about. And a lot of it has to do with hearing it so much in political speech, but it being such an empty signifier. And the only person I've ever heard explain it very clearly was someone who was a DeSantis supporter said, woke means anti-white. And I was like, okay, that's what that means to him. And we used to have extremists and white supremacists say all the time and meme this meme of diversity as anti-white. And so we have to confront our racial politics, especially as they're being clouded and utilized in these very twisted ways. It's almost like you need that Ovaltine decoder ring from the Christmas Story in some ways to get at the bottom of this. But once you start paying attention, you'll start to see meme wars everywhere.
Thank you. So I wanted to give an opportunity to let the audience ask some questions. So if anyone has a question for Joan, feel free to put your hand up. I can keep talking too.
No questions? Great. Get my limo.
There we go. Tons of them.
Get my limo.
This gentleman right here.
Come on.
Hi, Dr. Donovan. Thank you very much for depressing the living daylights out of us today. Very insightful, though. And I want to go back to part of the conversation you were having about, I mean, is it literally a matter of teaching the left or anyone to the left and the right how to be better? Or is there a tough question of whether you're willing to say things in those meetings that are just flat out lies? I mean, for some of that stuff on the right, I think it's a legitimate difference of opinion, or maybe a legitimate difference of opinion, but some of it's just sociopathic stuff. And does the left, or progressives, however one decides to define themselves, have to counter themselves with the same level of toxicity coming from the other direction?
It's a great question, and one of the things that we deal with in the book, and we come down on and we had a lot of discussions about this in my team about, well, what advice do you give? And I think the advice is that there's really nobody that wins the meme war, especially when people go into it knowing that you have to traffic in misinformation, you have to put up very transgressive, usually racist, sexist, homophobic content to get both outrage clicks and clicks from people who are on the fringe but are like-minded. And so, unfortunately, there's no winning the meme war. And we actually finished the book and then had to write an epilogue because some of the court cases from January 6th started coming back. And many people were going to jail for their participation in January 6th. And what had brought them into MAGA and this whole online meme war were things that we document in the book as being rather innocent in some ways or wanting to be playful. We do have this chapter that is particularly, was hard for me to write, called A Safe Space for Hate, about how people use the internet to self-radicalize online. And in particular, you have groups of people who now use memes in order to draw in youth who are very vulnerable, youth who don't have a strong sense of identity, particularly young white men who don't know how to be an ally. They don't know how to deal with themselves in the world. They see other identities being represented, and they see theirs, and they're like, well, what is there for me? Some turn to gaming and Kekistan. They consider themselves citizens of this online world.
I'm so glad you're going to explain Kekistan to these folks. This is going to be great.
It's just, well, it's an identity online where people suggest that because they're not in education, engineering, or training, that they're considered essentially like outcasts. And so they consider themselves part of this fantasy place called Kekistan. And they use like the symbols of frogs, and they have their own flag, and it's outrageous, but it gives someone something to do. It's an identity you can occupy. And so I think when it comes to talking about meme wars, we have to be really careful that our politics doesn't dip into this, because it cheapens our important policy debates, the nuance that we have to have around legitimate differences of opinion. And unfortunately, online, you have to think about social media a bit like a funhouse mirror. It's going to distort. It's going to make certain things look a lot better than they are. It's going to make other things look a lot worse. And you have to approach it from that point of view. And, when it comes to politicians, what's hard is that politicians want to be known for the policies that they enact. Nobody cares. No one cares that, so-and-so passed this anti-smoking ordinance. No one cares that so-and-so got $50 million in funding to cancer research. Like, it's forgotten. People remember if you're a scumbag, if you're a philanderer, if you're a thief, right?
If you shriek really loud.
Oh my God, poor guy. Yeah. He became the meme in of himself, right? Yeah. I'm not going to do it. No, I could, though. It would be a good place for it. Howard Dean, poor man, myth, legend.
Though also a forerunner in utilizing internet technology for campaigning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that there's a twist here in terms of online campaigning that folks like Clinton didn't understand. Definitely Biden has a very young team behind him, but is waiting, not to get into the transgressive stuff. But new politicians, new candidates are going to use this tactic constantly of outrage baiting and really trying to get folks to believe things that are completely untrue. And if you don't have an appropriate counterweight to that when you're looking at information online, and unfortunately, algorithms are literally called reinforcement algorithms, because once you search for something like QAnon once, say you're curious. You're just like, I want to see what this is all about. Trump mentioned it on the news. It keeps coming up. Watch 1 or 2 videos on YouTube, and for the rest of your life, it will continue to reinforce that interest, and you can't get away from it. And so reinforcement algorithms act as radicalization engines. And unfortunately, some politicians see that as an avenue to get in front of you. The other thing I'll say about news and partisan news is what partisan media learned is that everybody wants the news every day. Nobody wants politics every day. So partisan media piggybacks the politics in with the news. And so that's why you have other countries' news channels are much more flat affectively, and they treat politics in a whole different way than most American cable news that puts the politics in the wrapper of a news program.
We got time for one more question, because Joan is thorough in her answers.
I'll just keep talking.
I have a question about AI, and
Yes.
should we be as afraid as I think we should? Will there be a qualitative change or a quantitative change?
It's already happening, and it is horrifying. So AI is technology, artificial intelligence technology now. You only need about 10 minutes of someone's voice to make an entire fake of their voice. You only need about 30 images of someone, which we all have on Instagram, to make it look like they're saying something that they're not saying, to insert their likeness into either images or video. And so we saw this happen right around the time of Trump being indicted. You started to see some pictures going around of Trump being arrested rather violently. And they were very good-looking fakes. We also saw the Pope dressed up as if he was going to the club. Very good-looking. He looked good.
He did look good.
He looked good. But it's like the same thing that brings you that pranking can also bring you absolute political panic. Now, where we should be worried is with our young ones. So young women, unfortunately, are in a very precarious position here where we know already that 95% of deepfakes online are used to produce pornography. And because it's so easy to produce fake nudes of people, we see in high schools now students making deepfakes of one another in very compromising positions and then trying to blackmail our young women into giving them actual pictures because they're saying, we're going to send this to your family, we're going to post this online, it looks like you. So because we built the technology and deployed it without building any kind of guardrails onto it, any kind of watermarks, any kind of ways in which this technology would tell us it's a lie, we have very few things that we can rely on. So, you know, you can look at these online tutorials about deepfakes and they're like, well, look at the symmetry and the ears, and do they both have earrings on? And look at their hands, are their fingers fused together? And are their eyes the same color? You know, and so there are ways in which you can spot a deepfake if you know what to look for. But we should not leave this up to chance. You know, like it shouldn't be harder to spot a fake Rolex than it is to spot a fake of one of our loved ones, right? And so this is why we need legislation around deepfakes, and in particular what we call revenge porn or non-consensual image sharing up front. And we should call to task groups like OpenAI, for instance, that are putting this technology on the market without having any serious guardrails to prevent it from being manipulated. The last thing I'll say about large language models, or the ability to produce mountains of text from a single prompt, is what's in those large language models largely is benign. It's information that's been posted on Reddit or Wikipedia, things that have been posted on the open web. But some large language models, we suspect, are also being trained on people's emails. And so we don't know exactly which companies, like Yahoo, that might be doing this, or, you know, stores and stores of Hotmail or whatnot. But lots of personal information is starting to show up in large language models. So if you ask the right prompt, you might be able to get it to tell you where you live or what your birthday is, or, you know, who your kids are. Why this matters has a lot to do with our personal safety, our personal privacy, but also the kinds of things that we, when we posted on a certain website or sent an email with our address for a potluck, none of us consented to any of this. right? So the revolution that was big data that now gives us AI never protected our privacy. And now that we're in the era of AI, where they're deploying these models, and our faces are in them, our words are in them, and we have no privacy protecting us from what might be to come. I mean, in the most Black Mirror dystopic kind of way, my AI talks to your AI till the end of the world, and none of us have to check our email. Maybe that's a good thing, I don't know. But for the most part, I think we're no longer going to be able to tell if we're talking to a human or not. And we're going to have a really hard time figuring out if a person is who they say they are, if they can generate fake video, fake, audio, and it's going to be a lot harder to get at the origins in ways that we've always known how to do. I have a paper out that's free on datasociety.net called Cheap Fakes and Deep Fakes about this, and you can read it and email me with any questions.
Well, I think it's about time to wrap things up so we can all go burn our cell phones and computers at home. But
that's not the reaction. Come on, we're all going to make memes.
Right.
Yeah.
But that was fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Donovan, for coming and speaking with us today. The book is Meme Wars. It's available for sale at the front desk. Joan will be here to...